Hello, my name is Carolina Elizabeth, and today I'm going to be doing part one of 2 demos on Magenta garden roses. I will put a list of the materials in the comments section. Most of part 1 is placement, finding out where you're going to, finding out your composition. I start with doing a light neutral. Most of the time it's with transparent red oxide, a little bit of blue, and a little bit of white, and I just water it, or I tone it down with a lot of Gamsol so that it just makes a light mark, and I'm not fighting that later on. So right now I'm finding how tall and how low I want my total composition. So the general part, you're still going to have leaves and things that are going to stick out, but those I can just play with later on. Mostly I want the things that people are going to notice right away where they are. And so I just start placing those, just making simple lines. And I do draw. I know there's some artists that do not consider painting a drawing medium, but I draw to, a basic sketch of what it is. I don't do the details or anything in paint at the beginning. I'm just trying to figure out where everything's going to sit. If you have the light color, it's very easy to remove, and you just take a paper towel and you pretty much erase it. So you can start all over again anytime you mess up, and that's the beauty of painting, is that you just either paint over it or you just remove it, especially with oil paints. Oil paints take a lot longer to dry. For me, usually it takes about 3 to 4 days for it to dry enough to the touch. It's not completely cured, but it's enough to where I can go over it. Now I'm going to start marking out my big areas of space. For this, I'm using a little bit of yellow ochre and my rose, my deep rose. And so I'm just a little bit lighter than local color and still a little bit watered down, or it's not watered down, but it's a little bit more of a wash, I should say, with my medium. My medium at this point is a mixture of linseed oil and Gamsol, and it's half and half of each. So 1 part Gamsol and 1 part linseed oil. And then I mix it up. Usually I mix up a bottle and then just pour as I need into a little container that I can use as I paint. So I don't have to keep remixing every time I paint. So now I'm just looking for placement. So I take the basic shape, and like I said, I'm making a mixture of a lighter version of my my local color. And local color is, if you see a red apple, you say, oh, that's an apple's red. But if you start looking at it closer, you'll start to see it has bits of yellows or oranges or maybe even greens on there. Well, we call the red, because that's the basic color that you see, we call that its local color. So these are kind of magenta. And so we would consider that its local color, but as you can see, there's some areas that are much deeper, and then there's some areas that are much lighter. So I'm still working, my paint's not so thick, which I don't work very much with thick paint. I usually reserve that for my highlights, areas where I'm going to add white or a lighter color. Then I make those areas thicker. But in general, my paintings are very thin, or layers very thin. Now, what I'm doing today, I do this for a couple of, let it dry for a couple of days, and then I come back and finish off the painting. And usually I can do a couple of sessions that way because I don't like to work wet on wet. I feel like for me, it becomes very muddy. Like I said, there's some artists that are pros at it, and they can make one painting in one day in layers and layers. And that's awesome. I wish I could, but I do it this way. It works for me. Every once in a while, I can do small sketches where I can do them in one day, wet on wet or a la prima. But in general, most of my paintings are done in several sessions, a few days apart, enough to give that paint a little bit of tackiness so that it doesn't slosh around too much on your canvas. Now here I am finding my darkest areas. So it has a little bit of alizarin crimson, a little bit of transparent red oxide, and in some places, my darkest areas, it has ultramarine blue, and that's where you're starting to see some purples come in, is that ultramarine blue. And so I'm finding my shadows, my deepest shadows, and that helps me find placement and gives, of course, a lot of depth. Now, one of my struggles is my medium values. I can do my highlights and I can do my shadows really well, but my medium values, I'm always having to really work hard at getting those. And you know, that's just practice and that's just reminders. Now, a lot of people, they think that the thing about painting is color. And yes, we love color in paint. However, value is the most important thing next to shape. So you want to make sure you have your form right. That's where my drawing at the beginning came. But then you start to concern yourself with the value. That's why you can have black and white photos, or you can have drawings and they look realistic because it's the value that they worked on, how light or dark their color is, or colors. So I can do a monochromatic painting, and if I have my values right, it looks like a realistic painting. It has the realistic depth. Whereas I can have the perfect color on there, but if my value's off, it's going to warp my shape. So mostly I'm worrying about how light or dark is. I'm not so worried about, is that the perfect green, or is that the perfect magenta that I have on there. Mostly I'm concerned about, is that the right amount of darkness or lightness in that color. And I tell you this because sometimes I buy white flowers. I'm not a big fan of white flowers, but I buy white flowers because I can take them and pay attention to their form and pay attention to their value and turn it into any color I want. So I can take those same white flowers, and if I'm noticing where it goes from light to dark, I can turn those into pink flowers, which is my favorite, or I can turn them into yellow flowers, because the most important thing is that value, is that practice. So I would say to you, practice your medium tones, pay attention to that. Now, to find these dark shapes, I do a lot of squinting now, and some people don't, and I find myself doing less of it, as I move along. But at the very beginning, it helps me find those big shapes and find out where those darkest areas are. So this is a good time to be doing that, just to help you kind of mark out where your darkest leaves are, or the darkest areas of that, of those roses. In those darkest areas are where you're going to have the least amount of details, because we have a hard time seeing detail within shadows. And sometimes even if your eye sees details, you'll see that artists will mark out that entire area one solid shadow rather than showing that detail, because our eyes don't really pay attention to it. So you're better off just marking that entire, or painting out that entire area where the shadows are, one solid dark color, or your shadow, making it all one area. Now, I'm not married to the composition, so my flowers can look one way on my table, the actual props that I have, but I can move it around on my actual canvas. So if I see, oh, I like that flower over here, or it needs another flower over there, or I want to bend that leaf, it's your painting. You can work on that composition any way you want. You do not have to do it exactly how it is on the table. But the reason that I like looking at the actual object when I paint is because otherwise I find myself painting the exact same flower all the time, because it's the flower I imagine, or the rose I imagine. So having natural flowers and each of them being unique makes me pay attention to different shapes or different forms, other than the one that I imagine to be the one, how that flower looks, or how flowers look, I should say. Now, for my background, I like very neutral backgrounds. Not necessarily light or dark, but they're usually a little bit, not necessarily, no, they are kind of muddy. They are, because I like it to be neutral, and to get more neutral colors, you kind of mix in a lot of different colors. So my background has white, it has a little bit of black, a little bit of ultramarine, a little bit of yellow ochre, and transparent red oxide. And I try to make these very thin, so it has a lot of medium in it and a lot of Gamsol, because this is, like I said, this is just placement. I'm going to come back to it a couple more days and add more paint. So I don't want it to be too thick. I want it to be really thin, so that it makes it much easier, much faster for it to dry, for it to cure, and then for me to be able to paint on it. Now, the difference between, painting glass, sometimes I always confused whenever I painted metal. I wanted to paint, oh, that's a silver cup, so I want to paint it silver. Well, no, you're really not painting a silver cup. You're painting all the reflections from around that cup that sit on its surface, that reflect against it. Well, glass is the opposite. Glass, we are painting what we see through it. So a little bit of my background color, you're going to be able to see through that glass. However, because of the water, because of all the shapes in there, or the inside of the glass reflecting in and out or bouncing off the sides, you don't see it clearly. So there's going to be a lot of blurring out on there. But in general, we want to be able to see a little bit of that background inside that glass. Lets the viewer know that what they're seeing is something transparent. Like I said, if it was metal, if it's a reflective metal, you're going to see what's around it. So if in front of that metal is you're going to be seeing a little bit of your portrait. If there's a window, you're going to be seeing the reflection of that light from that window hitting the surface of of that cup or that vase, the metal on it. Now, sometimes if you notice the bottom of this bowl, you can see a little bit of white on one side. Well, that's the reflection of that table. On the other side, you see the edge is a little bit darker. That's because it's reflecting the shadow that is on the right side of the table, because our light is coming from the left. Now here I'm adding just a little bit more white to find those medium tones that I was telling you about. And I'm starting to shape my petals. So I'm not doing necessarily detail, but I'm paying attention where my flower gets a little bit, or roses get a little bit lighter. Now, even when we get to, I think we all have a hard time painting roses because we try to paint each individual petal, and if we want it to look realistic to that degree, then we take a picture of it. But I like it to look a little bit painterly, so I don't want to see each individual petal. I want to give highlights of some of the petals to let the viewer know that it has these thin petals, but I don't want to paint all 100 and something petals. That it might not have that many, but I don't want to paint each individual petal on there. I'm just going to pick the ones that stand out the most to me, that help it give its shape, let us know that those petals stick out, and then leave the rest, just those medium tones or local colors, whichever colors they are in that area. But I don't worry about all of this until in a couple of days. Like I said, right now I'm just trying to figure out where everything is and making sure that I have room for everything. At this point, I also, if you saw whenever I was doing the background, part of doing the background at that point is that it helps me kind of carve out my leaves, kind of carve out the shape of my roses. So at the beginning, when I'm doing those big blobs, I'm not worrying about, are they exactly that shape? I come in and do that as I'm painting that background. I start cutting and carving away where the petals stick out or where that rose kind of turns. Oh, my greens are Viridian. I use my cadmium yellow pale, or versions of this. My cadmium yellow pale, my yellow ochre, transparent red oxide, and I kind of mix those, interchange. Well, depending on what that leaf color is. But those are most of the colors that I use for painting leaves. A lot of times my darkest leaves, those tend to be Viridian with transparent red oxide, and ultramarine blue are my darkest. Now here, once again, it's where I'm doing those dark areas of the rose. Those are alizarin crimson and transparent ultramarine blue, I'm sorry. And that's where I'm getting that purple. On my darkest areas, on those, I add more of the ultramarine blue and transparent red oxide. Now, if you don't have transparent red oxide, I use a little bit of alizarin crimson and raw umber. So you can, there are some artists that just take 3 colors, and with those 3 colors, they can make any kind of painting. So you don't have to have all the colors that I use, and you can go about it different ways to get that same look. And sometimes it's a good exercise to practice minimizing how many colors to use. Thank you for watching. You can follow me on Instagram at carolina.elizabeth.art or go to carolinaelizabeth.com to see available works and prints. Please subscribe, like, and share here to receive more videos like this. Enjoy painting what you love.